So I set up, I was swimming in the sea a few years ago, and it was off the coast of Mexico. And I came out of the water, and this name came to me, Sutra Novum, and its sutra means thread, thread of meaning. We get Yoga Sutras, Kama Sutra, all the sutras from India come from that, and you get the English word suture, which means to thread a needle, threaded needle through some skin or some parchment, and that's a suture. And it's a surgical term, but the Yoga Sutra means the threads of meaning that bring you a deeper understanding of yoga. And novum was something that's new, right? And this word seemed very beautiful to me. It's a made-up word, and it's a marriage of the East and the West. And I'm a child of both, and my mentor was a child of both. He grew up in Panama and also India. And so he was a child of these two cultures. And I spent a lot of time in India. I spent a third of my life so far in Asia. And then I've lived another third of my life in the Americas and another third of my life in Europe. And I wanted to talk today about the incredible teaching that is the Course in Miracles, and some of the experiences I've had in the last few years, because I think it can be helpful to people to meditate on the problems in their lives. And there's some stories I have to tell which I think are valuable to people who are embroiled in deep psychological problems and torment. And last year I went on a psychotherapy degree in Britain, and to give some context of what happened, I would like to tell some stories from my life. But, you know, prior to that, I was in California, and I was processing a divorce with my previous wife, who had studied the Course in Miracles, but had been diagnosed as a threat to self and others, and put for a week in a psychiatric sort of safe unit. And she was just pushed to the brink, and her mind just, lost it. And she had the symptoms of extreme manic bipolar. She was running out, sleeping with lots of men, taking a lot of drugs, and went from being a sort of fairly together, beautiful, caring mother, and she was caught between myself, who wanted us to settle and have a life together, and quite humble. And I don't have many great success stories in the world, but I've had a deep interest in finding out what the truth is about our condition. And her ex-wife, who was a butcher and was quite controlling and challenging. And then her son, who had obviously her heart and needs as a pre-18-year-old kid. Anyway, I realized that there was no way I could fix the situation. I went to Southern California from San Francisco. And while I was there, I had a lot of time alone. I processed. I was in a garden that a friend of mine had introduced me to. And I was processing this deep set of reflections about the world, and about my existential inquiry into what life is about, why we're here, and things like that, which has been a constant pull in my life. And Socrates said that the unexamined life isn't worth living. And that statement is just a quote you see on a page, but it's a profound statement when you start to investigate it. It's something really deep, really. And one of the things I've been doing, because it's important here to clarify there's nature in the Indian philosophy, which is called Prakriti, and then there's Purusha, which is the world of spirit, right? And we say things like it moves our spirit, or it's inspirational, which means to be filled with the spirit. Expiration means to, let out the spirit. So it's like to walk in the spirit is the words that go into our basic language. And the most essential aspect of our life is breathing. Inspire, expire, breathe in, breathe out. And so there is a sense from ancient times coded into our language that there is a spiritual dimension to life. And anyway, I was in this garden, and there was a lot of space and quiet. My mother was helping me with food, and and COVID was going on, and I'd had COVID for 8 months. And it was quite a traumatic period, but a very beautiful period. Traumatic in the sense that I was going through a divorce to a woman that had gone off the rails, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I felt quite helpless, and yet I was surrounded, as I am here, by this beautiful nature. And I'm in Ecuador right now, and I will tell you how I got here in a while. But this experience that I was handling at the time was to, I've always been, since my 20s, a sort of an aficionado of Krishnamurti. And Krishnamurti says, if you have a psychological pain, don't try and change it, just watch it. And in the Bhagavad Gita it says you're not the doer. So these things that come up, and you watch them with a sort of neutrality, the doing of these emotions starts to drop away. And in philosophy there's this idea that there's this story that's playing out on a screen, and you're the hero of this screen story, this dream imagery. But behind all of that is the screen, right? And that doesn't change, and that's this state that transcends pleasure and pain. And so while I was there, I was studying a lot of the work of one of the great classicists of our time, and he's also a philosopher and mystic. He describes himself as a mystic, and he's someone that's studied the ancient Greeks before Plato. His name is Peter Kingsley, and he helped to explain how when the Greek genius fell, when it really started to fall sort of 450 BC onwards, with the rise after Parmenides, Empedocles, Pythagoras and Herodotus. After these men, there came Aristotle and Plato, and they really sort of, Plato was better than Aristotle, but Aristotle sort of led the society down a track that polarized understanding, and this greed of an empire led to its death, and Greece fell, and the technology and the gods went to Rome. They changed the names of the gods, and the mystical teachings went to the Sufi traditions in Turkey and the Near East. And I had an experience in the garden where I listened to one of his tapes, and I sat in the embryonic position, the fetus position, and I had an experience of astral traveling. It's not something I'd ever really been interested in, but it took me to the garden of a great mathematician that lives down the street from my parents. He's in a wheelchair now, and he's quite old, but he was without doubt one of the greatest mathematicians of the last 50 years. And he did pioneering work in many fields, but probably his most important work is in topology, which is the study of spatial dynamics. And he also did incredible work in what happens when numbers get very big. It's called the finiteness obstruction. And I realized, because I had been studying, if you go back to this idea of nature and spirit, well, the problems of man, a lot of it it's kind of three principal problems in the human dimension, right? The problem of fuel, how you're going to generate fuel, the problem of health, whether it's mental health or physical health, and the problem of the management of ecology. These are the three challenges that face our reality, right? And if it's the management of ecology, that includes all wars, right? Because when there's a sense of deprivation, nations and in-groups come in and fight in their name or oust the other. So that's diplomacy as well. So ecology is mapped both to fuel and politics, and fuel is about taking resources to generate power to drive machinery, to drive bodies. And so these things can all be they all, like, the fuel that drives your body is food. That's ecology. But anyway, basically there's these three things that we circle around. And I realized that at the same time, while I was in the garden, we were having breakthroughs in science, which are still sort of nascent. They're not fully formed yet. And at the very basis of science, there's physics, and physics has got two grand theories: the theory of the very small, the quantum, and the very big, which is the cosmological. And trying to marry these is the great holy grail of modern science. But behind those two shoulders of the giant that is physics, which is this sort of inquiry into the nature of the physical realm, you have the three laws of thermodynamics. And so the coldest temperature in the universe, one of the two constants that we know very well, is is 0 degrees Kelvin, and the other constant is the speed of light. And these shape our understandings of physics. But what we found when we get very, very, very close in recent times to 0 degrees Kelvin, then the laws of thermodynamics that operate at all times through the universe, just like Newton's laws operated until Einstein started to question the orbit of Pluto, and quantum theory came in, and relativity and all these things, this great renaissance that happened in the turn of the last century up until the 30s and 40s with his colleague Max Planck. These revolutions in science are profound and fascinating. Any school child that's passionate about science will be inspired by these kind of conversations that form the basis of our investigation into reality. And you've got the Big Bang, and you've got how most of the physical world is just empty space, and an atom is mostly empty space, and then you have smaller and smaller subatomic particles that it's just our study of those things is yielding breakthroughs in fuel. And the biggest breakthrough, in my understanding, is an understanding of ecology where we don't shit in our own backyard, we don't shit in our own house, and that means we don't use nature in such a way that pollutes our home, which is at the moment Earth. We're going to move to Mars, but somehow we're going to have to find ways to keep homeostasis, the balance of things, in alignment, right? And we, as is the nature of history, will screw up again and again, right? But over time we learn from our lessons, and that's the history of this. And so I was very interested in this finiteness obstruction, and the influence of it all came to me in a sort of flash, and I came to see how, in order to break the strong force, which is the force which keeps protons from fusing, right? And when E equals mc squared, when you fuse two protons, which are like, the atomic number of an element is based on how many protons it has. So hydrogen has 1, helium has 2. So if you fuse two protons, which happens in the sun to get helium, E equals mc squared, you cause a breakdown of the strong force and release huge amounts of energy and create a new element. And that's called nuclear fusion. And nuclear fission is when you get the heavy elements like uranium and you break a bit off, and that also creates a huge amount of energy. They're two opposing forces that have the same effect. They change the constitution of matter, and they create huge energies of of fuel, essentially, in terms of, like, you know, if you look at science, science is a study of what happens, but technos is a Greek word which means to harness fire. So technology is taking the fire of our discoveries in science and creating new technologies. And so I came across this revelation that, you know, subduction is this process by which we see, ever since the birth of photosynthesis, which came after the sulfur based life forms on the vents that you find around volcanic activity in the seas and on the earth. We had the rise of cyanobacteria, and those cyanobacteria were essentially the first life forms, and what they did for millions of years was just pump out oxygen into the atmosphere. And when that happened, they also sequestered carbon from the atmosphere, took the poisonous gases out of the atmosphere, and we were led on a path which gave us a totally different atmosphere and led us to the possibility for the evolution of the higher life forms. But what it did also was cool down the planet. So the combination of the oxygen and the cooling and the sequestering of the carbon gases into the earth created the fossil fuels. And then we come along millions of years later and we dig down and we take out the fossil fuels and we drive innovation and technology, cars and so forth, the combustion engine. And then we, you know, create these incredible factories and we burn all this carbon, we put the carbon back in the atmosphere and we heat the atmosphere up, and our homeostasis, the balance of our home, is in danger. And so we need to think, like, how do we solve that? And so we need to create technologies which generate fuel which doesn't just line the pockets of greedy vested interests and pollute the atmosphere and challenge our stasis on Earth, our balance on Earth. And so I came up with the word duction, and duction is related to the word ductile, and it's like this sense of walking the line, right? So you walk the line, you don't like, because religion is about, like, kind of, it means religio means to re-link with the spiritual realm, right? But in terms of living in harmony on this planet, we need to walk the line of not shitting in our food, right? On our plate on the table. We've got to live in a way that doesn't debilitate the larger story. And the larger story is what the Greeks, you know, that's the meaning of logos. It means to act in alignment with the whole, right? So you don't leave a mess behind you which others have to clear up and may even cause destruction, chronic destruction. So duction would be a way in which we don't pump the atmosphere with carbon gases and heat up leading to the greenhouse effect and the ozone hole and all the problems that come with pollution. But we use our technology in a way that gives us a savory situation, a planetary model that isn't toxic. And one of the things that I have also was inspired about in the realm of nature was the work of Alan Savory, because, you know, right now in New Zealand there's a tax on cow farts, right? But then if you look at Savory's work, and it's really interesting because Savory is an ecologist in Africa, there are symbols in the unconscious, right? And the symbol for the devil in the Christian world has the horns of a goat. And you look at that and you start to realize that, you know, the Sahel and the Sahara, these great deserts in Africa and in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, these deserts were generated because at the beginning of the era that was, you know, defined by agricultural shifts, which is relatively recent, it's only the last few thousand years, we got these incredible things that gave us meat and cheese and milk, called goats, and we used them like lawnmowers, and we domesticated them and we drove them through this Eden. It was Eden. It was the original garden of man. It was out of which, you know, it was the fertile crescent out of which mankind emerged into Egypt and the Near East, and then they spread across Asia and into North America and down into South America. And the Asians, you know, they travel down through Indonesia and Polynesia and down into Australasia. So this source of the human story was greatly impacted by the misuse of the first technology, which was the goats, right? And we somehow knew that, you know, walking through this savannas and these great forests that was in Central Africa at the time, that by eating down to the roots, like we were doing something wrong, and unconsciously this destruction of our habitat became symbolized with the goats' horns, and that was like, I'm sure of that. I'm sure that that's unconsciously where the symbolism of the devil came from, because we were doing something which was destructive to our homeostasis, to our balance in the universe. And so I had this experience of traveling to the garden of Terry Wall, and I was fascinated. I was like, wow, this is really important, because our maturation as a species on a certain level, it depends on, you know, three things, like I said, like fuel science, ecology, and the production of food, and then psychotherapy, like the right attitude of mind to handle all these problems. These were primary, including the physical health of the human being and his peace of mind and so forth. So this was my great inspiration. And then I got sick with COVID, and I had some challenges because I was trying to help my ex-wife. I was trying to be there for her. I was quite torn because, you know, she had kind of slept with a lot of other men, and it was a very painful time for me as a human. And yet I was looking for, as is the nature of a healthy, right-minded attitude, I was looking for meaning. And you know, in the Course in Miracles, it says very early on, my meaningless thoughts are showing me a meaningless world. And it says, projection makes perception. And so what we project onto the screen of mind as our set of conclusions about the nature of reality decrees the world that we live in to a great extent. And that's why forgiveness in the Course is such a powerful tool, because those erroneous thoughts based on fearful projections create a hell, a living hell. And unless we have the humility to look in the mirror of those thoughts, then we're not doing mind training. And that's why Socrates said, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living. So I got to tell my host in the garden in Altadena near the Pasadena, what's it called? It's the Jet Propulsion Lab, right? And so it was an interesting place to be. I was in this ecological paradise, and I was having these sort of deep visions of a sort of Jungian level, because if you read Jung's work, his closest associate, the person that really, he said was the only man that understood him, was a professor at the University of Sorbonne in Paris, and he was a student of these mystical traditions that went to the Sufis. And so I think he tapped into that, and I definitely was tapping into this with Peter Kingsley's help. I saw a particular lecture that he gave, and that really influenced my experiences. So when this lady came to the garden, she said, do you want anything? And I said, I might like my wife to visit, because I'm trying to be there for her. My green card was dependent on it, and I was trying to be supportive of her, but she was just psychotic, and it was very, very challenging. And it was torn, because she'd been quite cruel, and she'd also been mentally ill, and she'd also been someone I deeply loved, right? And it was completely, I was married to her. And in marriage, it says, basically the vows of marriage say, I'm going to stay with you whatever you say, right? So I can handle really harsh stuff, and I will absolve those misperceptions. Of course, there's a sin is a misperception in the unconditional love that is the fulcrum of meaning in my heart, that I come to you to share at that level with, which is what marriage is about. It's a profound devotion. But then she'd just gone off the rails, but I was still devoted as a husband. We weren't divorced then yet, and I was trying to do the right thing. And the moment I said this woman in her 50s that just recently died of cancer, she kind of went on a crusade to get rid of me, even though I'd done thousands of hours of work for her. without pay except a place to live while COVID passed through and I processed my green card process. So then she switched off the water, she came in, she tried to kick me out, she kicked the door in my face. She got these people who were around her that were aggressive and made me out as a villain when I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd just done hundreds of hours of work for her and been a security guard. And I stood my ground because I'd lived there for a year and a half and she was trying to illegally evict me and break the contract that we were engaged in. So I took her to court, and then the judge sided with her because she was a dentist, and she lied about how she had to kick the door down because it was old, and I'd lived there for a year. I'd never kicked it open. It was something you could just open normally. So she had the power of the money and the establishment behind her. And in the Course in Miracles says, would you rather be right or happy? Now I was right. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had a lawyer that was ready to sue her. And then it just came to the point where this was hell. She'd switched off the water. I was living a pretty basic life, trusting in the forces of a deeper goodness, and I was trying not to be combative, and the only way I was combative was by standing up for my rights, which were done in a non-violent way. My mentor was a student and friend, associate of Gandhi, so like I've always been quite a peaceful man because I recognize that force will just perpetuate ill-feeling and enmity, and in the end the deepest changes happen at the level of the individual that's ready to transcend aggression. In the Course in Miracles it says the only way to safety is to attend to the process of consciously and unconsciously ending attack thoughts, because where there's attack thoughts there's going to be always a defense, and you're always stuck in this paradigm of upset. And the Course says I'm never upset for the reason I think, and basically I'm upset because I'm hiding from the ego thought system that I'm completely brainwashed by. And until I look at it objectively, I can't transcend that, the highs and lows, the constant ups and downs, and come to the screen behind the story that has blinded me from my deeper reality. So I went to Hawaii with thanks to some friends, and I worked on some farms, and then I got long COVID again, and this time I had some intimation to go back to Britain. I thought I had a better support system there, so I transferred my green card to consular processing, and I went back, and I'd been handled like, this woman was very crafty. She had called my parents because she was looking for every tangent possible to illegally evict me, and I knew that that's what she was doing. And so she used her sister, who was a psychiatrist, to try and make me out as having psychological issues, which I didn't have. I was honest, I was processing a very painful divorce, but it wasn't something that had made me psychotic. And I was inspired because I was thinking along the lines of, well, if we can crack hydrogen fusion as a combination of revolution in understanding, because the problem with hydrogen fusion at an artificial level is, the Chinese have gotten temperatures 100 million degrees higher than the sun. That's a lot. But we still don't have fusion. We have it in very small parts in America, but it comes down to replicating that gravitational force field that you see in the sun, which is huge, right? So we've got the temperatures, but there's some missing ingredient because we haven't cracked the gravitational force fields artificially on Earth. And duction would be anything that doesn't lead to the heating of the atmosphere. So that could be any kind of renewable fuel, solar, wind, wave, all of that stuff would be duction. It wouldn't create shitting in our food, in our ecosystem, right, in a toxic way. And duction would be also in alignment with Alan Savory's work, which is like, you need more cattle, not less. The New Zealanders, they have this tax on cow farts, and it's because there was a paper written some years ago, a long time ago. But if I tell you that cow farts create global warming, then it's like it's something it's like pink elephant is a much better domain name than real tech solutions. The pink elephant stands out. So this paper, which is just plain wrong, has dominated a lot of the economic and agricultural and political arguments and policies that we look at today. And so Savory's work was like, if you increase the cattle and you do rotational grazing, that means it mimics what happens when there's predators that keep the animals, the hooved animals on the prowl, right? So that means they go in a large group for safety in numbers, and they poop out the food that they eat, and that is, they stay in one place for a week or two by a watering hole, and then they move on to another watering hole, and they basically chew down the grass, not till it's completely destroyed, which is what happened with the goats when we came across the Sahara with them, but to the point where it's low but can regenerate, and it's got all this fertilizer that can bring it back up. And then you plant things, you plant vegetables and things in that, and you have like bumper crops that are 2 or 3 times what the production when you don't have this animal fertilizer. And that way you have meat, you have cheese, you have milk, you have a soil that is very, very rich. And because you're producing so much healthy green and not deserts, you're not having this imbalance in the carbon production because the plants are taking it back in, and so there isn't this imbalance. There's these thriving ecosystems. That's part of duction, and the other part of duction is not to use mass industrial fuel processes or mass industrial processes that use fuel to pump out poisonous gases. And so this set of revelations was like, okay, well, that's fascinating. There's a deep insight in that. But I also was like, well, what am I going to do for income? And how do I handle this sickness? So I went back to Britain, and, my parents had this psychiatrist calling up, trying to support her sister, the dentist, who was kind of greedy and jealous that I had a wife, and just very petty and vindictive. And I didn't judge those people, but I had to handle their behavior, and I was in a vulnerable position. And then so I went back to Britain, thanks to a friend in Los Angeles putting me up to sort my stuff, and I transferred my green card to consular processing. And I went back to Britain, and my father had this residue of misunderstanding about me because the work that Terry Wall had done, his daughter's a doctor, and she made me out as some kind of monster because he just had a stroke, and I was like inspired to talk to him. And because I'm not a mathematician by training, they thought, well, this guy's off, he's obviously losing his mind. I wasn't. I was just interested to have an inspired conversation with him. And it was a man whose mathematical capacity is way beyond the top 10 on the planet at one time, just in a league of his own. Of course, his conversations with people like that are dynamic, but he was in his 80s and he's not very well. So I had that, and then I had, on top of that, these women that had sort of called up and made this big ruckus that there's something wrong with Nathan. There was nothing wrong with me. They just wanted to make me out as someone who was losing his mind and so forth. And I wasn't. I was actually in my right mind. And in the end, I had to sort of put up boundaries. Psychotherapy is all about healthy boundaries in some way. Boundaries to these people who are abused. And so is the gut. If your gut wall gets ruined by leaky gut syndrome, you can't operate properly. So is farming, right? Boundaries, healthy boundaries are very important. If you don't get the right fencing around these temporary fencing around the cattle, you ruin the ecosystem, right? And so that's why farmers use dogs, and in Alan Savory's method, it's all about these temporary fencing. So you give them an area where they can't leave, and then they graze that, and then the grass around that area gets to regenerate, and then you move them on, and that's how you create an ecosystem that is thriving. And the Greeks tapped into this. They were really like, and Aristotle kind of knocked us off. And so these were incredible revelations. And I got back, and so I was dealing with trying to heal myself with the right diet from some psoriasis, but worse, this long COVID. And then I was also dealing with my parents' misunderstanding of what I was looking at. And so I tapped into this idea that, once we have nuclear fusion And it may cost 550 million or thereabouts for a nuclear power station once we crack the gravity, but that's a guess, because a major industrial production like that is in that range. And it's like the quartz watch. When we first invented the quartz digital watch, it was extremely expensive, and now they give them away at gas stations. In fact, they're not even really currency anymore, because our phones have taken over, technology moves forward. But I was sort of like, wow, this is fascinating. And I thought that I could create this organization that would champion these ideas and match it with the deep mythological background that inspires them. Because it's, as Einstein said, if you want to be intelligent, if you want your kids to be intelligent, read them stories. If you want them to be really intelligent, read them lots of stories. Because if you study physics or chemistry, it's full of anomalies. Chemicals are like creatures, and they have natures and behaviors that make them unique and fascinating. So I was inspired, and definitely living a sort of maverick kind of mind, but not anything that was misconceived. And I was also handling an emotional burden of going through quite a difficult divorce, and looking for new purpose, which is the resurrection of meaning. You die many times, you have many suicides in your life, not of the body, but you die to an adolescent, you die to your childhood, you die to marriages when they break up, you die to many things, right? You die to a career in one field, you move into another. This is the nature of maturity. Handling those transitions takes great forbearance, and that's what maketh a man, or a woman. So I came back, and then I had to sort of find a new path, because I was in Britain, my green card was in consular processing, it might take several years, and I had some support from my family. But then after a few days, I was trying to stick to a certain diet, and I went out for a meal with my niece, and she called my father and said, he's such a spoiled child. And I'm like, it was so beyond their understanding of what I was trying to handle, because when you're sick like that, COVID is challenging, and there's so many factors that go into it, and so much misunderstanding of it, and we don't know where where it will end. History's like that. You can't predict what's going to happen 5 years. We don't know where these modern plagues are leading, and it's the second major modern plague in recent years. The last one was AIDS. And so I was handling that, and I was trying to follow Hippocrates' wisdom, that you are what you eat, and you also are what you eats. So I was handling all those things and trying to improve my microbiome, and I was pretty exhausted because I had chronic fatigue syndrome. And my father insulted me, and he just brought this brute force in and was quite aggressive, and bless his soul, I couldn't handle it. I was sick, and I was like processing a lot of challenges emotionally, and I felt very weakened. So I called a friend, and he let me stay in his room and helped guide me to get on a university degree. And I thought this was a good path because I could get funding, and I trained, because my interest in the Course in Miracles, it's psychotherapy. I chose a degree in psychotherapy and counseling, and I got on the degree. And then it all happened quite quickly within 2 or 3 months. And by the end of those 3 months, that was my second bout of COVID, and it was over. And so my plan was to get this degree in psychotherapy, which I'd spent my whole life. I spent a decade in India studying yoga, and I also studied Jung and different psychotherapists, and I was fascinated by it. And obviously it was a passion of mine, because one of these three things in the triangle of man's problems is physical and psychological health. The other thing is, I said, fuel, and the third thing is how we manage our ecology. And they all melt together because they all influence each other. The fuel is the basis of our economy, because everything, whether it's the car or the gas in the cooker or the heat in your house, how we get our fuel creates our civilization. How we create our policy, whether it's a dictator or a democracy, creates our civilization. And how we reflect on challenges in our story leads to our psychology. That these things create our civilization. So I was interested to try have a fresh look at why I had this inkling that Terry Wall's work on the finiteness obstruction would help us to look again at hydrogen fusion. And I had this great intuition that gyroscopic forces would be extremely important in creating this artificial gravity, the level of artificial gravity matched with the heat that could fuse two protons and create a working nuclear fusion reactor, which would absolutely revolutionize our economy. And I had this sort of naive sense that I think I share with Oppenheimer, in the sense that, you know, once you have that kind of power in a bomb or a nuclear power plant, the bomb's going to deter more war, and the nuclear power plant is going to give us a totally different economy, so we're going to be prosperous. But my journey through this was like, first of all, I was on the psychotherapy degree, and they asked the question, you know, how would you create safety in a group? And the answer to that question, it can't be argued with, is the ending of attack thoughts, because it's only where there's attack that you need defense, and then you're stuck in this paradigm of attack and defense, right? And if you look at lesson 135 of the Course in Miracles, it says, purportedly it was dictated to Helen Schucman, Dr. Helen Schucman, the clinical psychologist, by Jesus, that, you know, the ending of suffering comes down to the ending of attack thoughts and defense thoughts, right? So when you, in my defenseless, my safety lies. And it's interesting because David Attenborough, I was very fond of him as a child, but he, in his private life, collects very expensive Chinese plates and cups and bowls. And he collects fossils which have, they're called amber fossils, and basically sap in prehistoric trees, trapped insects. The insects couldn't get out. They struggled and they struggled and they struggled. And the more they struggled, the more they got embedded in the sap, and then that got fossilized, and he collects those fossils. And in a sense, you know, attack and defense thoughts is like that. We get trapped in the ego thinking, and we never transcend it, and we get stuck and fossilized and trapped in this cycle of suffering that the Indians call samsara. And so Jesus was said, if we're all one and we're taking sides and blaming and attacking and defending, there'll be no end to war and conflict. And that's what the ego wants, because it traps you in this idea you're a body. And so I you know, this is, you know, there's a book that comes with the course, and it's called the Psychotherapy Pamphlet. And so I said this, and then one of the students on the course, an ex-police officer, a woman by the name of Kirsty, she said, well, what has attack got to do with safety? And I said, well, everything, because it's part of the dualistic paradigm that is attack and defense. But by that time, there were all these identity politics that were playing out, and I was painted as a chauvinist and a misogynist and a homophobe. Now, I've lived with gay men, and I've lived with gay women. I have close friends that are gay men and gay women. And my ex-wife was a lesbian for 20 years. And I am not remotely homophobic. I really mean that. I believe that, you know, if you're attracted to the same gender, you should have a right to explore that sexually, and you have a right to express that expression of love in the physical form. Why condemn that, right? But there was a woman on the course that heard me talking, because we're supposed to talk about traumatic experiences and bring those to the table in a spirit of trust on a course like that. And that's how you build, you know, he's like, I've told you a deep, dark challenge that was in my life. Please don't betray me and, you know, make it into something it's not. You know, I may be flawed, but don't attack me, right? Because that's, you know, this was a psychotherapy course based on Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers has 6 tenets, but the 3 core ones are enlightened empathy, or I've changed it to enlightened empathy, because you can have ego empathy. Ego empathy is, I feel your pain, right? And enlightened empathy is, I see your pain, I recognize it, but I focus on the light that obscures it. And that's where the healing is, right? So that's the only way you're going to transcend the ego thought system, is with enlightened empathy. And then unconditional positive regard, which comes from Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard was a Christian philosopher. And, you know, so that's and the other thing is the idea that the therapist is in a state which is more inwardly coherent and cohesive. And those three things become the tripod of bringing up people to that aspect of recognition of their deeper self and transcending the pain that has limited them to the victim mind. And so I was in this circle where we were opening up, and I said, well, I got married to this lovely woman. We were both very much in love, and she had a 12-year-old son. And when you look at indigenous cultures, when a boy is sort of between 12 and 14, he starts to have strong needs from masculine guidance, and that's just historically the case. You go find your father in the story of Telemachus and Odysseus, right? It's this mythological path that every young man goes through. And even a woman, she needs those, because it's the masculine role to define the boundaries, and it's the feminine role to do the nurturing. And everyone has an androgynous character, which has got this nurturing nature and this clear boundaries and competence, which is the masculine, right? And the marriage of these two creates a balanced human being. But I will never have the feminine intuition that a woman has in the way that she has it, right? And a man like has these strong needs to go off on the hunt, if you like, and to fill in his needs to rise to the masculine archetype. And we have such a rate of chronic divorce in the West right now. That commitment to, I will not walk away no matter what you say. I will devote myself to your demons and all, and transcend that and be, linked to be together, to raise a family. That is the traditional vows of marriage. Now, I had a gay friend while I was living in the garden and the houses in California, who I asked him, I said, because he was living with his partner, they had a house, he was a very close friend, we would walk 3 times a week. And I asked him, what do you think about gay marriage? I didn't proffer an opinion, because I'm not gay, and I support gay lives and gay needs, but I wanted to hear his viewpoint, because I felt it was arrogant of me to make a presumption about gay marriage when I'm not in that realm, right? And I've got friends in that realm and I support them, but I wanted to know what he thought. And he said, I think it's come a bit too early. I don't think the gay community that's developed, this culture, is quite clear enough about what that means, And he was a man that lived with his husband, and not his husband, they weren't married, but they'd been partners for many years. And I don't know if they had separate bank accounts, I can't remember, but this was his opinion, and he was quite a thoughtful man. And I'm not saying that's the opinion you should subscribe to, but it was interesting because it was a very intelligent, thoughtful, successful man who was quite, open with me about his thoughts about things, and we shared often about deep things, and it was heartwarming to hear that. And I don't think it was an attack on gay culture. If anything, he was an ardent supporter of gay culture and gay rights, as am I. But it was a mature reflection on the the challenges of marriage, right? Not just straight marriage, but the potential of gay marriage. And of course, he wasn't against it. He wasn't like, this is wrong, but he was like, I think it came a bit too early. I think we hadn't quite settled into our identity and our sense of what was balanced. It was like a shotgun move. But then, a couple that are gay that have been together for a long time, they should have a right to a pension when the other dies and things like that, just as straight people do. But that being said, our discussions were kind and not mean-spirited. But when I got onto that course and I told the story of my ex-wife's ex-wife being bitter and jealous and kind of controlling, and she lived in the house they owned, and I had moved around the world. I'd gone back to India to close my apartment. I'd gone to Mexico for 9 months to process due process in accord with the green card process and the immigration and all that. I did everything by the book, and I honored the system, and I'd really sacrificed a great deal to be with my wife, and I was committed to her. And yet she was kind of jealous. The ex-wife of my ex-wife was jealous that I was, developing this healthy bond with her son, this masculine role model. And I was, teaching him about Emerson and the founding fathers of the United States, as I'd been taught by my mentor. And he was very interested in zoology and biology and paleontology, and particularly entomology, which is, study of insects, and then herpetology, the study of reptiles. He was just fascinated with all this stuff. And that was a similar interest of mine as a child. So it was like she was, as I experienced it, and on a course, in psychotherapy, you can only talk your truth. This other mother of his child was sort of sabotaging this. And in a way, I could feel her pain, because her wife had left her and fallen out of love with her. And that's, that kind of rejection can be very painful. So her pain body was looking for retribution, and she kind of took it out on me, whether it was conscious or unconscious. And I talked about this, and I said how, this process of being stuck between myself and this ex-wife and her son's needs, and all of those needs trying to be balanced, was very, very challenging for my ex-wife. And it was challenging for everyone, because those kind of transitions are. But where there's maturity and there's empathy, and there's not attack thoughts, and I wasn't trying to undermine this woman. I kept away from her as much as possible, but she brought in the sister-in-law, and it became this big drama to try and undermine me so that the ex-wife could get her ego dagger needs met. And it was also, in the Course in Miracles, it talks about being in the battleground, right? And so I was trying to navigate that story without attacking or joining that mentality, right? Which, I was trying to see her in the best light. But then it was impossible not to see her in the best light, but it's impossible not to feel attacked and undermined. And so that was basically the death knells of my marriage. And when these tactics were so devious and so clever, all I could do was withdraw and hope that my ex-wife or wife at the time would see through it, because she'd studied the Course in Miracles, and not become a pawn for these petty, ego strategies. And so I withdrew. And then when I saw how it had debilitated my ex-wife's mental health to such a point that she ended up in a psychiatric ward as a threat to self and others, I hated my ex-wife's ex-wife. It was a very raw, egotistical feeling, right? And then quite a natural one, and not to justify it, but like Krishnamurti said, I didn't act upon it. I watched it, right? I withdrew to a friend's ranch in Yosemite. I processed the green card. I stood there and thought, well, once she comes to her right mind and she's ready, she'll reach out to me, and we'll take it from there. But it was very hard to handle. And I described this story, and I described how after a year of viscerally hating this ex-wife and my own ex-wife, I woke up one morning and I was this revelation, kind of, this projection I'm putting onto this woman comes from within me. I can drop it. And I told this story in the psychotherapy group, and there was a woman in the class, and she just assumed I was homophobic, right? Because she'd been married, she'd had a difficult breakup, and she was like, okay, this man's homophobic, I'm now a lesbian, he's speaking badly about lesbians. I wasn't. I was talking about my process with regard to handling those difficult things. And so I was accused of being homophobic. And then she said, how dare you as a white straight male? So that was racist. And it's all this kind of toxic woke politics that came in, have an opinion about such things. And I was like, well, it was my marriage, and I was obviously having to have an opinion or a thought process around how to handle it. But then it got to be this crescendo of neurosis. And there was a professor on the course, a woman who was also someone who converted to lesbianism. And she did so, she said, because, she missed the sex. And she had these extremist views, which, there's this idea that, women have had a harder time in history than men, and even John Lennon wrote the song "Woman is the nigger of the world," and there is a lot of arguments that back that up. I grant you that, but then more men have died in wars than women. More men have mental health issues. More men commit suicide than women. Like, the whole statistics are skewed in this ideology where the ego comes in and says, okay, I'll use gender as a reason to subsume and undermine others, right? And it's like, well, if I do that, I'm like at this bottom level, and I don't take the side of the men or the women, because that's fear-based, right? Because that's like, okay, one is better or greater than the other, and it's like, no, we are complements. I can't have a baby, right? You can't have a baby without the sperm as a woman. So there's these things that we just, when we're in alignment, we don't become at each other's throats, right? And when the shadow work isn't done, and Jung said the shadow work is all our hidden desires that aren't expressed, and all our fears and anger that isn't expressed, when we don't do that, and the Course in Miracles describes that as our hidden thoughts. If we don't express those, if we don't process those, we become a puppet that's controlled by them. And in our conscious minds, as Carl Jung said, until the unconsciousness of our consciousness is made conscious, we are ruled by it, and our life, what we call fate, controls our lives, and we don't come to destiny, which is a conscious unveiling of the hidden thoughts in our minds, so that we can transcend those fears and express or experience those desires in a healthy way, which is what the shadow is. And so when you get married, you have this honeymoon period, and if you're not careful, after that high of like, oh, he's perfect, she's perfect, you start to see, the ego starts to identify all the flaws. And then if you don't express those or work them out between you in a mature way, you have a battleground, and you end up in this love-hate relationship. And so I processed this, and then I came to the Course, and I was looking to study more of Terry Wall's work. I started to find mathematicians, and I was happy to be on this course. And then suddenly a young man threatened me with physical violence because I was speaking maturely about how people weren't taking responsibility, and I basically got crucified, right? And it's quite interesting, because when you look at the Christian myth, whether you believe in Jesus or not, here's a character who doesn't compromise truth to appease, posturing, political posturing, and status posturing, and all these victim cards. You've sabotaged the rules of working on a Sabbath by healing a blind man. All of this stuff that the ego loves to but you're not living by the rules. You're and so I was like, well, someone that had gone so deep, that's had such profound teachers, I was like a sore thumb, because people would be like, they were so entrenched in the ego thoughts, right? And the psychotherapist was like, how dare he question what I've said? And even though I didn't do it in a way to try and hurt them, because a baby that has some scissors is a danger to self and others, and a mature adult will take the scissors out of the hands of the baby, and the baby will cry. And so that maturity, which had gone very deep, which didn't think I was special or better than any other, but didn't side with these toxic arguments that patriarchy rules the world. That's not true. Women have immense power, right? Just say that to any husband that is sensitive to his wife's needs, right? So there was this whole prevailing dialogue that male dominance, white supremacy, all of that was, it was veiled, and it was used as an attack. And I'm like, well, I grew up with a black sister. My mentors were brown. What part of me is racist? I was accused of being, racist by some people. And it was like, I was in Ecuador once years ago, and I was with 8 British white women, and we were on a beach, and 2 men, brown men, came up and put a gun under my head, right? So anyone can be a victim of racism. Now, was that racism? No, not necessarily, but I was the victim of a different race, right? And it was violent crime. Um, so all of these things were getting fleshed out, and the academics weren't mature in the way they handled it, right? So then what happened was I went to the head of the department, and I'd been talking about the caste system, right? And you can't talk about Indian culture unless you mention the caste system. And I talked about it briefly, you know, just because everyone was given their chance in the group, and some people spoke more because they were enthusiastic, and others were more quiet, and that's just the nature of group dynamics. But there was this underlying argument that we're here not to make judgments, and unconditional positive regard is our focus on all, one and all, right? And yet the academics were supporting very conditional negative regard and making me out as someone who wasn't dedicated to the focus of the course. So then what happened was, you know, Viktor Frankl, he was the psychotherapist that was in the, I don't know if it was Auschwitz, but it was one of these German concentration camps. He had said that an abnormal reaction to abnormal behavior is normal. So it was all very fine until that point, and then I went to the head of the department. I said, look, this academic in the department, she's abusing her academic authority because she's saying, oh, I find the word caste offensive. And I hadn't used it in an offensive manner. I wasn't saying, hey, we need to bring the caste system in to our culture, it's wonderful. I was saying it's deplorable, right? And it is something that's very difficult to resolve. And I also was saying, like, we can't say that romantic love, which is very, very challenging, leads to almost 50% in all the Western countries divorce rate versus 1% in arranged marriages, which was the model of the world pre-12th century. Once the 12th century came along, arranged marriages started to die off and romantic marriages. But because it's freedom of choice, right, in the West, then that freedom of choice leads to lots of silly decisions, and also and especially with marriage, because the moment it gets tough, people just go off and try and find someone else. But you still have those issues to handle, right? I'm not saying divorce is bad. Sometimes it's the best decision, but often it's a cause of great suffering, lots of bankruptcy, lots of bitterness, lots of problems with mortgages, whereas in India it's 1%. Now, I'm not saying India is better, I'm just saying a mature mind would reflect on the challenges of romantic love. Like 1 in 2 marriages fail. What is different in the Indian system is that they don't expect you to be a god, right? Which is what the romantic love is. They took the Madonna out of the church and they projected it onto the opposite sex. And then you have all the shadow work to do where you're so upset with the flaws in the other. Whereas in India, they're kind of expected, and so there aren't so many ups and downs around intimate relationships, and also there's a family-oriented culture more. I am not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying that both can be healthy mirrors of reflection on the limits of the other. And that was totally misunderstood. And then I also talked about, like, something I'm quite uncomfortable with is this whole movement towards the sabotization of the pronouns and the politicization and the ego wars over it. In Estonia, there is only one pronoun, essentially. You know, it's it, right? And the context will decree what it means. And in Spain right now, they have lobbies that are trying to change the le and the la, you know, to something that is neutral, like the Estonians. But it's the language, you know, and it's like, who cares that, you know, a bowl is masculine or feminine? Does it really matter? You know, it's like, it's the culture. And then you can get anally retentive about these things and be really quite destructive for reasons which are petty and meaningless. And so this was what I was seeing this kind of stuff on the course, and it was like the academics were leading with this, and they were trying to teach sanity or processes which help to inspire sanity, and they were doing it in very insane ways, right? Because they were promoting judgment while saying no judgment. They were promoting very conditional negative regard while promoting, with words, unconditional positive regard. And it wasn't coherent at all. It wasn't in alignment with the teachings of Carl Rogers, which I think he's quite admirable, his process, right? And they were also quite cultish in that this is the only way, this is this way or the highway. And there was no avenue of discussion to say, well, you know, this is what Jung introduced and so forth. And so like this, what was supposed to be a well-rounded education became basically a place where egos vied for superiority. And so I went to the head of the department. I said, look, I'm uncomfortable. I've been threatened with physical violence by a young man who thinks I'm denigrating his father when I was talking about how I could be his father's age. And when I was his age, I had lots of challenges with my father because a young man is under he's under the spell of the mother complex. So he's so taken by his mother's view that he can't see the two sides of the story. And so he thought that was an attack on his father for some unknown reason. And he threatened me with physical violence. I was accused of being, you know, homophobic and misogynistic by this lesbian student. And she said, who are you as a white man to have an opinion? And I said, well, that's racism right there. You know, I grew up going to rallies to get Nelson Mandela out of Robben Island, you know, and that was radical for the day. You know, my sister was black and my parents were staunchly in support of the ending of apartheid. And here there was a black woman on the course, and as she was letting, you know, influence as a young person by all these arguments like, oh, he's, you know, you see in the sitcoms how men are just constantly denigrated. And women are always these sophisticated, you know, altogether creatures. And that's sort of the culture right now. Women are thriving, and that's a wonderful thing. But then it was like, we'll take out this guy. And I am not a basket case. I'm quite intelligent. I'm quite communicative. I'm quite empathetic. And another woman had talked about how, you know, her grandfather had died. And in the context of the conversation, I had said, you know, well, you know, imagine if that happens 1,000 times. This was it was a string of things about, you know, I mentioned my life in India, and it was supposed to be a place where we could speak freely. And I was saying, you know, that I'd studied in the Course in Miracles, and I'd studied in India, Ramana Maharshi, and he'd said, you know, we're not the body, and that there comes a point where we have enough suffering that we transcend the idea that we're a body, and then there's a sort of shift into a different set of thought systems. But again, I was attacked for that. And then watching this woman walk across the room, right, she was half black, and I'd been raised in a family where the culture was very much in support of black lives, in a way promoting the ending of apartheid. And yet, despite having this incredibly liberal and loving and humanistic perspective, I was made out by accusation and projection and misinformation and misinterpretation and defense mechanisms that I was this racist, sexist man, and I'm not remotely any of those things. And so I went and reported this to the head of the department. Now, I went to the student union later, recorded on audio tape what happened, and I was told that she should at that point have convened a disciplinary committee. But then, because she went and talked to this academic, her name was Sue Price, and said, you know, I've got a report that you're saying misandrist, which is hatred of the masculine, as opposed to misogynistic, which is hatred of the feminine, things to this man. You're being sexist, you're tutting, and you're sighing, and you're, you know, scowling in the class when you're supposed to be promoting unconditional positive regard. You're promoting heterophobia in this, you know, which doesn't do anything for homosexuality, because, like, if I go around saying as a straight man, you know, homosexuals are terrible, let's protect heterosexual people at all costs, then I'm just creating division, right? And so she was kind of, by her attitude, doing that, and it was her wounds that were speaking, and she didn't have the maturity to see it, despite having a PhD in psychotherapy. And so I was up against this kind of very bigoted behavior. And so the head of the student union had said, well, you know, at that point when you reported it, you should have been granted the disciplinary committee, because you've been threatened with physical violence, you've been had to handle hate speech in the form of like racism towards, you know, the color of your skin and your gender and stuff. And it was just, It was out of control, but the university protected this mob that was growing. You know, the women would cry, and there was this, like, all this posturing that, like, and then they would laugh and after I was kicked out, and it was all like, we will justify a scapegoat. And it's no different to what the Nazis did. It's no different to what what happened to Jesus. It's this mythology of where it's actually, there's a theory in social science about this called mimetic theory, and it means people will come together and join together in a group desire, and in the process of adhering to that group desire, they will go and chase the successful victory of that plan, which says we'll get this resource, and then we'll scapegoat someone as a victim, and we'll, you know, and that's got nothing to do with this unconditional positive regard in group dynamics that's aligned with Carl Rogers' teachings. So there I was, reporting the abuse, and I said quite pointedly, I don't want to hurt these people. I just don't want to be taken out and hurt. I said this to the head of the department. Her name's Carol Wilson. I said, I don't mean these people ill will. I know what's talking is their pain. I know they're projecting it onto me. Perception makes projection. I'm not okay with this kind of behavior. You know, one of the kids has gotten to the point now where a young man is threatening me with physical violence. And so this is where it really went out of control, because, you know, an abnormal reaction to abnormal behavior, well, okay, the world is full of abhorrent behavior, right? But this was on a course in psychotherapy, which is supposed to handle that and transmute it into the gold of healing, right? And sanity and caring and empathy for differences and union at the deepest meaning of psychotherapy, which is also the deepest meaning of religion. And so these sentiments were really quite toxic. And so the head of department, supported the academic who did everything in her power to drum up this resistance to get me out. So I went to the student union. I said, look, this is what's happening. And it was just like this mob attack of aggression and undermining. And I wasn't spewing anything that was misogynist. I wasn't racist in any way. I was just talking about the psyche of man and the challenges of characters that were wounded and spiteful. And I was singled out to be a monster. So I had to go to the police because I went to safeguarding teams. I could see that I was being threatened quite vigorously in very passive, aggressive, clever ways that were couched with PhDs and things like that. So I went to the police and I reported. Once, you know, the administrators all backed this illusion that I'd done something wrong. I'd threatened someone. I hadn't. I'd been threatened. I'd never said anything racist or sexist, but I'd been made out to be that kind of person. And this was what you call false weaponized victimhood, weaponized false victimhood. And so I went to the police and I said, look, I'm being taken out. And it's like they're using misrepresentation of my behavior. They're making this big argument that I'm insensitive. And yes, maybe from the ego perspective, I might have said a couple of things that were insensitive, but they're not justifying this behavior that is very much conditional negative regard wrapped up and presented as, oh, we're so compassionate and caring, when it was really narcissistic compassion. It was like, I don't like this person. I'm going to scapegoat him and I'm going to justify my attacks on him, all in the process of discussing how to create a safe space, which means to annihilate someone who isn't a threat, but I'll make him out as a threat because my ego feels uncomfortable. And then that's where the course comes in and says, well, my meaningless thoughts are showing me a meaningless world. And it takes great maturity to look at this, to examine this. And so what happened after that was I wrote to the Solicitor General, and I was under immense pressure because they were kicking me out. I couldn't go to my parents' house because my father was too neurotic. I had to go to a doctor, or I suggested someone go to a doctor to report the stress I was under, because I didn't have film footage of all the stuff that I just recounted. And I could see how these academics were just completely crazy. You know, they were propounding one set of thoughts and then doing the opposite, you know, saying, you know, unconditional positive regard, no to sexism, no to racism, and they were just compounding all this behavior to do the exact opposite. And so I went to the Office of the External Adjudicator for Higher Education in Reading, and I had to file a complaint because there was a woman called Faye Sherrington that was the head of the student studies at like pastoral care and things, and she created a committee to assess my suitability to study, right? And I'd gone to the safeguarding teams, and it just grew and grew and grew, and I had to go up the ladder of command. And I went to I ended up going to the police, but it took me 2 trips to get to the police over the course of a week. I went to the security guards, and I represented. And each time I was like, look, I'm very calm, but I'm witnessing what's happening. And it was a slow explosion where they were building up momentum to take me out and make me out as a monster. All this happened at Edgehill University in Lancashire. So I contacted the MPs, I went to the police, and on the way I couldn't remember, I was about 8 miles out, and I couldn't remember if I'd left the oven on because it was so quite stressful. I felt like a hunted animal. So I called the lodge, the security lodge. No one picked up. They were busy, and it was a concerning situation, and I was under immense psychological pressure. And I was like, okay, I can't start a fire. There's already a fire going on under my ass. I'm being burned out of here, but I can't start a fire. So I called the fire brigade. They came out. They made sure that the oven was off, and it was just complete. Because I was so pressured by these attack thoughts. And the irony was that it was on a course which was supposed to examine how to create a safe space. And it was a catastrophe. It was like a Chernobyl. It was like one era of authority up the ladder after another, up the ladder after another. And so I got to the police, I filed a safeguarding concern. I went to Reading not long after, and I went to Manchester to try and serve an injunction against this committee that was a joke. It was basically convened to support this hate speech and annihilation of my character. And I then went to the Solicitor General. I said, look, I'm being taken out because the Solicitor General in Britain is like, they're in charge of the universities. And I was just trying my best to handle these people that were abjectly and absolutely breaking the charter of the university, violating the Human Rights Act number 2.2. And also they called up the doctor and tried to make me out as a menace using the testimony of these people that had been whipped into a frenzy of neurotic hate by projecting all their shadow stuff onto me as if I was the devil incarnate. And the doctor he said, well, you're telling me you're interested in this physics and you're concerned that you're losing your foothold, which was true. And he tried to project manic bipolar on me. He said, your symptoms seem to demonstrate manic bipolar, because he was influenced by this. I said, sir, my ex-wife was manic bipolar. I walked through the valley of hell with her, the valley of death. And I, stood by her, and despite the immense psychological pain, I'm not manic. I am telling you the truth about what's happening. I've been scapegoated and being attacked for being a decent, innocent man that stands up to immoral acts. And I've been made out to be the immoral one, and I'm not. So I basically told him, look, if you try and pin manic bipolar onto me, I will sue you. And I managed to get a Freedom of Information Act of what he'd written about me, and he said, maybe, so there was no sense of like, let's go and have a clinical trial here. And I tried to I said, look, I said to his colleague, I said, look, I can't fight them unless I have some kind of crutch to handle this. So I said, give me the Asperger's test. I will deliberately flunk it. And I recorded this and sent it to the OIA, and I sent it to the police. And I said, I am being taken out, and I'm trying to use the system to hold up the mirror to the abuses that they're handling. And she let me take the test, but then it was very complicated. And eventually it got to the point where I had nowhere to stay because I didn't feel safe on campus. So I'd been corresponding with a Christian monastery in Sussex, and I went to stay with a friend in London. He put me up in a youth hostel, and then the next day I went to the monastery. But the couple of nights prior to that, I complained about how the police were handling it. And I was staying with my foster brother, who's got some serious psychological issues. He's had them since he was very young. And I got a call on the way back from the supermarket near his house. It's a long walk. And the police called me, and a police car went by, and they said, I hear you have a complaint. And I had written to the Solicitor General, and when I was in Oxford, there was definitely, I mean, without doubt, it was an undercover police team, and I was in a cafe. I could feel I was being hunted because I'd gone up the ladder, and when I mentioned, my teacher's relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt and things like that, well, I mentioned his relationship with Indira Gandhi, and how he'd advised her not to send in the army, right, to the Sikh temple when there was the uprising, and she didn't listen to him. She listened to her generals. She sent them in, and the consequence of that was that they killed her. The Sikh bodyguards, several months later, in revenge for going on their holy ground, they killed her. And they were very proud people, and unfortunately, in a similar way at the moment with Putin, he's a very proud man, and he doesn't like NATO creeping up on his door. He's got very limited protective walls to his country, and he has an empire, and he doesn't like the way the West denigrates that empire, and he's the largest country in the world. And so, we could do some very stupid things in Ukraine, and I just, passing sentence, I said, I really hope we don't do things to rile Putin too much, because the consequences could be dire. And I included a picture of my teacher, who was brown, right, and was given citizenship by America because he was such an exemplary character, such a noble man. And I think they must have confused me for a terrorist. Under extreme, abnormal conditions, abnormal reactions to abnormal behavior is normal, right? And so I was being made out to be a monster, which I wasn't. And I was like, also, we were handling this incredible challenge with Ukraine. And it was really in a quite toxic time last year, in sort of 2022, the fall and winter of 2022. And so I was being hounded, and I just, I had hobnobbed with this man who was, advisor to presidents and prime ministers at highest level. And so I thought, I'm not going to be intimidated by you, and, try and recognize the voice that's talking. But what they saw was a brown man. And they sent out a committee. They thought I had some kind of psychological illness. And, I wrote to Amnesty International. There were two plainclothes policemen. There was a woman that came up. They sat in the cafe on the 3rd floor in Oxford. And they sort of, as I was sitting there, I sent a letter to the Solicitor General, and I wrote to a bunch of national newspapers, Amnesty International. I said, look, if you pick me up and try and make me out as being a criminal or a threat to national safety, this email's been sent to Amnesty. And that moment, within a few minutes of that being sent, these guys got up and went, and the heat was off. But then I had been logged in the system as a potential terrorist threat. I mean, it was crazy. That's all I can assume, because I sent FOIAs to Thames Valley Police, and I've sent, they were out of Staines and so forth, and to the Cheshire Police, to the Merseyside Police, and the Lancashire Police. And a lot of stuff's redacted around that time with my name. So at that point, I just was feeling hunted, and it was crazy. And in the Course in Miracles talks about the authority problem, and it goes up and up and up. And the Milgram experiment talks about this, how a man in a lab coat will give guidance to electrocute people, and the more they get answers wrong, the more the electrocution goes up. And very few people resist him, because authority is so powerful over our minds. And it sort of explains how the Nazis were successful. And it explains why Edgehill University was able to support this sort of witch hunting that happened to me, right? So then I got to the monastery. I'd taken my SIM out because I didn't feel safe. I felt tracked while I was staying at my brother's. After I got off the call that night, there were maybe 6 police cars. I didn't feel safe, so I took my SIM out and I went for a walk. I told him I wasn't coming back for a while. And as I walked along the estuary in the place I'm from, in the Wirral, I saw about 6 or 7 police cars looking for someone. There were the sounds of barking dogs, of police and stuff. And it was just a horrible, horrible feeling that I was being hunted, as if I was some kind of, because it all started in that room in the University of Edgehill, where some women thought, oh, he's against us. He's got these negative thoughts, and who is he to say that, safety begins with the ending of attack thoughts? Well, yeah, it was the truth speaking, and they took out Socrates in the same way, and they took out Christ in the same way. And I'm not comparing them in substance, but in principle I am, because I hadn't, advocated aggression. I pointed out how it was being used against me, and then I was asked to be removed from class. And so when I saw that, I packed my bags, I went to the monastery, I walked across London so I couldn't be tracked on tape, because I was an innocent man and I didn't want to be taken in and made out as mentally ill, right? Because they could do that. They could bring in a doctor, they could say, what is your interest in Terry Wall's work? And I could explain it, and then they could say, but you don't have the background in mathematics. And I said, well, but this came to me in a visionary way, much like Carl Jung's experiences. But they said, well, Carl Jung was a doctor, and they would hold these things over me and denigrate my intelligence and make it out as some kind of psychosis. So I was in a very dangerous plot. And when I saw that after 2 weeks in the monastery, when I put my SIM card in, I was going to go out with this monk to buy some groceries and to talk. And he got a call that morning because I put my SIM card in, and he said, look, I've been in this trade as a monk for 40 years, I've seen it all. And he thought I was on the run from the law. And I was, but not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd been made out as a monster. And I didn't want to be stuck in that toxic realm where they justified attacks that had nothing to do with the truth of what was actually going on. So at that point, I went up to London, I rented a hotel for the night, I booked a flight from Heathrow, it was the 25th of December, and I flew to Canada. And my friend, a black gay man, picked me up and took care of me for 2 weeks, put me up in a room, rented an expensive apartment. And then I went to South America because my friend paid for a flight, and it was the cheapest place I could go. Bear in mind, I just had my second bout of COVID, and I've had 2 bouts of COVID since then. And the university charged me £6,000 plus 7% interest for an education, in inverted commas, in which I handed in no assignments, I was not assessed, and I was abused. And I reported the abuse and didn't want the people that were abusing me to be harmed or to be undermined, but just to look in the mirror of what was going on and to tone things down. And then the university protected the people that abused me. The woman who was like the academic that was really the main agitator of the abuse, she was fired after my appeal was thrown out, and I reported that to the police and the BACP, and they've done nothing about it. They and the university is hidden behind it. And so what I've tried to do, because I think it's a story for our times about the dangers of gender politics, because I had said, like, if a man doesn't honor his inner feminine, he becomes a brute. And if a woman doesn't honor her inner masculine, she gets walked all over, and there's all this people pleasing, and it's toxic. And in that sense, we all have an inner they, and I have grave concerns about this kind of pronoun police that you don't have in Estonia, because they just have one pronoun. And it's all for this ego arguments to try and justify undermining of the other gender or different political viewpoints, whereas true magnanimity, politics means family of man, means having a dialogue, duo logos, the meeting of two in my name, for the progenitor, for the growth of deeper wisdom, is what true democracy is about. It's about having a discussion. I don't know everything, you don't know everything, but we'll meet in the middle, and our collective unknowing will meet with humility to find out the answer that is the most supportive of growth and morality in this moment, right? So that wasn't what was operating on this course. It was scapegoating, attack thoughts, and defense thoughts. And I was like, in my defenselessness, my safety lies. So I had to report the abuse, right? And I had to get away from this duality of he's bad, they're bad, right? And I had to say, look, we're all good, but to transcend our fears, we have to look at this projection of bad so we can absolve it in the light of a deeper yearning for love, which is in us all, which is the process of psychotherapy. And that was ignored. And then I had to go back to Britain to get my, because they tried to kick my stuff out. And it was just a million things that I had to handle. And so I went to work on a friend's retreat center in Spain, and then I got long COVID for a second time. And my father wouldn't even let me stay at the house, and it's taken a long time to heal that relationship. And then I had to go to Portugal because I was trying to stayed on a friend's retreat center, and she knew I'd been really hurt. And then I got COVID for a 4th time. And so now, after like a year of this madness that I had to handle at the hands of Edgehill University, I'm able to tell the story. And it's like, well, they want me to pay £6,000, right? Which is what I borrowed from the SLC. And it's like, well, this story is exemplary. There's something powerful about it. And how do you take broken eggs and make an omelet? How does healing happen from this hate? And the best way to do it is to expose the truth and to tell the story. And you know, anyone that's hunted like that, you know, has to, I had to try, I was being, because all the people that were siding with Sue Price and Danielle McNulty, particularly, this was the student, and these people were like, Nathan is a homophobe, Nathan is, and it's like, no, I'm not, you know. But all of them were siding with them, and it was like this car crash of one authority after another supporting this argument that I was something I wasn't. And so I was made out, you know, women biologically and culturally tend to gather in groups and niche. They have this whole creche word, you know, which is about supporting young children, which comes with being the aftermath of pregnancy. And men tend to be like, you know, they have to go out on the hunt and they have to race after whatever it is, a sale or whatever, to provide for that family. And so they're more like, tend to be more loners and free thinkers and less gossip oriented and community oriented. And of course, if they don't honor that aspect of themselves, they become outcast and socially awkward. And so there has to be a marriage of the masculine and the feminine, both, because if you become too enshrined and indoctrinated by groupthink, you can't step out of it and question it. And that's the challenge in the feminine mind, when it becomes biased and petty. And it's the challenge in the masculine mind when he becomes cut off from the movement of the needs of the group, right? And but when both are not in alignment, you have these toxic, and I wasn't out of alignment. I was speaking to the needs of the larger group in the best way I could, and I certainly wasn't speaking hate speech, and I certainly wasn't saying anything denigrating to the opposite sex or to homosexuals or transgenders, but I was made out as that, right? And perception is 9/10 of the law. So they had these people coming in saying he was completely insensitive, and I wasn't, you know. I was speaking with maturity, with an incredible lifetime behind me, and I was made out to be something I wasn't. And that was a very, very dangerous position to be in. And I had to jump through all these hoops to evade capture by the trap of that ego strategy which wanted to make me out as a monster. And I don't see any of those people as monstrous, but I see their behaviors as unconscious and the product of wounds that haven't healed, right? And that's the danger when someone is a leader on a course like that and they make out a monster, right? That's the whole myth of the bogeyman. If you can go and watch a horror movie and get to the other side of it, you can walk through the horror of your greatest fears and transcend them. But when you cement the bogeyman as something real that can't be overseen with love and light, then you make scapegoats. And that's what happened to me. And that's why, you know, the wisdom of the Course in Miracles is so profound, because it says if you get locked in the thinking of the ego, you will always create victims and victimizers. And if you transcend that kind of dialogue, that limited, like corrupted dialogue, which is sort of like what I associate in a sort of meta way with Aristotle, you create the destructive, self-destructive patterns that define the toxic human being. And they're not toxic human beings, but they're humans that have been infected with a toxin that they can't even see is alien to their true identity. Thank you for listening.